The debris field shouldn't have been rotating. That was the first thing Supreme Commander Verksal noticed when the long-range feeds resolved into clarity. Not the human ships, there were so few of those it barely registered. Not the orbital installations, which his analysts had already cataloged and dismissed. It was the debris. Old satellite fragments, decommissioned station husks, pieces of rock and metal that had been drifting in predictable decay orbits for decades. All of it was moving. Slightly. Almost imperceptibly. But moving with a kind of deliberate, concentric patience that orbital mechanics alone could not explain. He watched it for 11 seconds before his tactical adjutant interrupted. "Commander, the perimeter is complete. All 1,244,000 vessels are in holding position. The humans have not responded to our final approach signal." Verksal pulled his attention away from the debris. He filed the anomaly in the category he reserved for things that didn't matter yet. He would spend the rest of his life regretting that. The signal had arrived at Earth's Deep Space Monitoring Array 41 days earlier, and the person who received it wasn't a general, a president, or anyone whose name would later appear in official histories. Her name was Dr. Maren Voss, and she was eating a breakfast sandwich when the alert tone changed pitch. Not louder, not faster, just different. The specific pitch that meant the system had detected a structured transmission and run it through initial pattern analysis and concluded, with a confidence rating of 99.7%, that the structure was not natural. She set down her sandwich. She looked at the waveform on her screen. She looked at it for a long time without moving. Then she picked up her phone and called the one person she was supposed to call in exactly this situation. A number she had memorized 5 years ago and hoped, quietly, she would never need to use. "It's Voss," she said when he answered. "We have a contact. And Erickson, it's not one signal, it's millions of them, simultaneous, from every cardinal direction." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that she checked the connection. "They're already surrounding us," Erickson said. It wasn't a question. "They've been surrounding us," she corrected. "The signals are 41 hours old. Whatever they sent, it arrived first. The ships are already here." That distinction, signals first, then ships, would become the first of 3 things about this situation that nobody on Earth fully understood until it was almost too late. The second thing was why the Dominion had bothered to send a warning at all. The third thing was what the debris field was doing. Within 6 hours of Voss's call, every major government on Earth had been notified. Within 12, the feeds from long-range orbital telescopes had been compiled, analyzed, and delivered in classified briefings to approximately 400 people across 19 nations. The number of ships surrounding the planet was so large that the analysts had initially assumed a calibration error. They hadn't assumed that for long. 1 million vessels, Admiral Chen said, standing at the front of a room that had gone so quiet you could hear the ventilation system. Arrayed in a spherical formation. Closest element is holding at approximately 800,000 kilometers. They are not advancing. Someone in the back of the room said quietly, "They don't need to advance." Chen didn't argue with that. She turned back to the display. The formation the Dominion had constructed around Earth was geometrically perfect, a shell of firepower so complete that escape in any direction was mathematically impossible. Every analyst who modeled it reached the same conclusion within minutes. If those ships fired simultaneously, the resulting energy release would sterilize the planet's surface to a depth of approximately 60 meters. There would be no warning. There would be no defending against it. The only variable the models couldn't account for was the reason the Dominion hadn't done it yet. "They want something," Voss said. She hadn't been invited to the briefing. She'd been brought in because she was the first contact specialist on duty when the signal arrived, and nobody had thought to send her home yet. "The signal isn't a declaration of attack. It's a demand structure. They want formal submission of planetary governance. recognition of Dominion authority, a census of biological population, and... She stopped. And what? Chen asked. A complete inventory of our weapon systems. Voss looked up from her tablet. Not a surrender of the weapons, an inventory. They want to know what we have. The room was quiet again. Why would they want to know what we have? Someone asked slowly. If they could simply take it. Voss didn't have an answer for that yet. Neither did anyone else in that room. But 2 floors below, in a much smaller room with no windows and very bad coffee, a man named Colonel Ashad Demir had already begun to wonder if the Dominion asking for an inventory was not a demand. It was a warning they were giving themselves. Demir was not a diplomat. He was not a scientist. He held a position within an organization whose official mandate was so classified that even the classification level of the mandate was classified, which meant that when he was eventually brought into the response planning process, approximately 70% of the people who met him had no idea what he actually did. What he actually did was study how humans survived things they shouldn't survive. Not battles, not wars in the conventional sense. He studied the specific, granular, almost biological process by which human beings, individually, in small groups and nations, refused to accept that situations were terminal. His files contained case studies spanning 4,000 years of recorded history, sieges that lasted decades, supply chains that shouldn't have worked, resistances sustained against occupying powers with overwhelming material advantage. He had cataloged, cross-referenced, and analyzed every documented instance of a human force or population that should have collapsed and didn't. He had a theory about why. He'd never been able to prove it, because no situation in human history had presented exactly the right variables. Until now. He spread his hands across the orbital display on his desk, a personal one, not the room-sized version upstairs, and looked at the Dominion formation surrounding the planet. "Commander," said his aide from the doorway, "they're asking for you in the main briefing. Admiral Chen wants to know your assessment of the tactical situation." "Tell her the tactical situation is fine," Demir said. His aide stared at him. "Sir, there are 1.2 million warships surrounding the planet." "I know." Demir straightened and reached for his coffee, which was cold. He drank it anyway. "Tell her the tactical situation is fine. Tell her to focus on the inventory request. And tell her," he paused, looking at the display one more time, at the debris field, at its slow, concentric rotation. "Tell her not to move the satellites. Whatever they propose, whatever they demand, do not touch the satellites." "The satellites," his aide repeated. "Not one of them, not a single piece." He was already moving toward the door. "And find Dr. Voss. I need to speak with her. She noticed something in that signal that nobody else flagged yet." "How do you know what she noticed?" Demir stopped in the doorway. He looked back at his aide with an expression that was not quite a smile. "Because it's the same thing I noticed," he said, 11 years ago, when we built the debris field. The Dominion's first formal misinterpretation of human behavior came within the initial 72 hours of the contact period, and it stemmed from something so mundane that Supreme Commander Verksal would later describe it as the moment his certainty first fractured. The humans had sent a response to the Dominion's demand structure. It was polite, measured, professionally worded in 17 languages, with an offer of simultaneous translation into Dominion linguistic formats. It acknowledged the presence of the Dominion fleet. It acknowledged the power disparity without any apparent emotional distress. It requested 48 hours to compile the requested inventory of weapon systems. 48 hours for a complete inventory of a planetary weapons program. Verksal read it 3 times. Then he called his chief xenobehavioral analyst. "They are not panicking," he said. "No, Commander. A species with 11 warships, facing 1 million, and they are not panicking. They appear to be organizing, Commander. There is significant communication activity across their surface. Substantial energy signatures consistent with large-scale coordination. But the communications we've intercepted carry no indicators of fear-state vocalization patterns. Verksal considered this. Every species the Dominion had encountered during expansion followed a predictable behavioral sequence when presented with overwhelming force. The sequence varied in duration but not in structure: shock, denial, bargaining, either submission or suicidal resistance. All of it driven by visible panic, all of it legible. The humans were doing none of it. They don't believe us, Verksal concluded. They cannot process the scale of the force arrayed against them. Their minds are defaulting to normalcy because they cannot physiologically accept the reality of the situation. His analyst made a sound that might have been agreement. It was the kind of sound that covers uncertainty. That must be it, Verksal said, and decided to allow the 48 hours. Species in psychological shock needed time to arrive at acceptance. It was more efficient to wait for collapse than to force it prematurely and generate chaotic resistance. He was wrong about all of it, but he would not discover that for another 19 days. Demir met Voss in a corridor outside the main operations center at 300 hours, which was the only time either of them had been free. She had dark circles under her eyes and was carrying a tablet so loaded with annotation that the screen looked more like abstract art than data. He had the specific expression of someone who had been waiting a long time to have a conversation they'd rehearsed in private. "You flagged the timing signature," he said without preamble. "The signal arrived 41 hours before we could have detected the fleet with our existing sensor arrays," Voss said. "They sent the warning before we could have known we needed it. That's not a demand. That's a courtesy from an entity that expected us to be completely helpless and wanted to give us time to make peace with it." Demir started walking. She fell into step beside him, which tells us something extremely important about how they perceive us. They think we're already defeated. They think we were defeated before they arrived. He pushed through a stairwell door. "There's a difference, and it's the difference we need." Voss processed this. "The debris field," she said. 11 years ago, we began repositioning decommissioned satellites and orbital junk under a program officially classified as debris mitigation. The cover was legitimate. We were genuinely concerned about Kessler syndrome. But the positioning algorithm wasn't random. It was geometric. We placed roughly 400,000 discrete objects into a spherical lattice at varying orbital altitudes, each one containing a passive, shielded payload. Voss stopped walking, passive. Nothing active, no power signature, no emissions, nothing any sensor sweep would classify as a weapon. He stopped too and looked at her directly. "They inventoried our weapons systems and found 11 warships, 3 orbital platforms, and some ground-based missile defense systems built in 2031. And they concluded that's everything. They concluded that's everything." Voss stared at him. The corridor was very quiet. From somewhere above them she could hear the faint sound of voices, the endless, continuous activity of the operations center that had not paused in 4 days. "Tell me what the payloads do," she said. Demir told her. She didn't say anything for almost 30 seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice was completely flat. "How many people know about this?" "Currently, including you 47. "And you're telling me because?" "Because in approximately 16 days, the Dominion is going to conclude we've made our peace with the situation. They're going to begin the formal occupation protocol. And the first thing they'll do is send ground teams to verify our inventory." Voss understood immediately, and when they get close enough to do that, altitude verification of the debris field will require their scouts to pass through 5 distinct lattice layers. Demir resumed walking. At that point, the geometry of the system becomes visible, and they will understand, for the first time, exactly what is surrounding them. Voss let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "We didn't close a trap," she said. "We were born inside one. We've been building the walls from the inside for 11 years. "That's the part," Demir said, "that they haven't figured out yet." The Dominion's second misinterpretation happened on day 9. 300 of their smallest scout vessels were dispatched to conduct preliminary atmospheric surveys of Earth, standard preoccupation procedure. They expected no resistance. The 11 human warships hadn't moved. The orbital platforms were running on minimal power. The communication from Earth's surface was cooperative, organized, and completely transparent. The scouts entered the upper atmosphere and began their descent pattern. 90 seconds later, 47 of them experienced simultaneous electromagnetic interference so severe that their navigation systems defaulted to emergency manual protocols. They regained control within minutes. No damage, no apparent source. The interference vanished as cleanly as it had appeared. Verksal received the report and cross-referenced it against the inventory the humans had provided. There was no system on that inventory capable of producing the effect his scouts had experienced. Equipment malfunction, his chief engineer suggested. 47 vessels simultaneously. Possibly a natural magnetospheric phenomenon. Verksal pulled up the atmospheric data. The readings were completely normal. No solar activity, no magnetic anomaly, nothing that should have caused what his scouts reported. "They hid something," said his tactical commander, Sarenvac. She was the youngest commander on his senior staff and the only one who had been consistently skeptical of the humans' cooperative posture. "The inventory is incomplete. We verified against their industrial infrastructure signatures. There is nothing. We verified against what their infrastructure should be capable of producing based on our models," Sarenvac said. Her voice was very controlled. "Commander, when did we first develop those models?" Verksal paused. The long-range survey of this system was conducted approximately 3 solar cycles ago. 3 years. She let that sit for a moment. "And when did we begin receiving passive intelligence from the outer edge of this system?" 11 years. 11 years of monitoring, 3 years of detailed survey. She stepped closer to the display. "Commander, what if whatever is producing that interference was built specifically because they knew we were watching?" The room went quiet. It was the first time any member of Verksal's senior staff had seriously entertained the possibility that human behavior over the previous 11 years had not been unconscious, had not been random, had been responsive. It lasted only a moment. Then his chief analyst said, gently, "Commander, the probability that a pre-contact civilization correctly inferred our surveillance methodology and developed countermeasures to it is effectively zero. The mathematical." "Bring me everything we have on the debris field," Verksal said. Nobody in the room moved. "Now," he said quietly. The debris field data took 18 hours to compile because nobody had compiled it before. It had been classified internally as navigational hazard material, the kind of analysis that gets handed to junior cartographers and filed without senior review. When it finally arrived on Verksal's display, he spent 4 hours examining it in silence. His aide brought him food. He didn't touch it. What he was looking at was not a debris field. The mathematics were subtle. They were so subtle that he ran the analysis 3 times because he was convinced he was creating patterns from noise. But the third run confirmed what the first 2 had suggested. The objects in Earth's orbital space were not randomly distributed. They were arranged in a lattice. A geometric structure of extraordinary complexity, distributed across 47 distinct orbital altitudes, with an angular precision that passive drift could not have maintained over 11 years without active correction. Active correction that had never shown an active power signature. Because the correction was passive, Gravitational. The lattice was self-stabilizing, each object positioned to be held in place not by thrust, but by the precise gravitational relationships between adjacent objects, like a structure assembled from stones that held each other up by their weight alone. It had taken Verksal 4 hours to understand what he was looking at. It took him 11 seconds to understand what it meant. They built this to be invisible, he said aloud to the empty room, not from the inside, from the outside. He stood up. His chair scraped back sharply. They built a structure specifically designed to be undetectable from the approach vector of a hostile fleet. He moved to his communication console. "Get me Saren Vac." She appeared on the screen within seconds. She was not surprised to hear from him. He noticed that immediately she was not surprised, which meant she'd been expecting this call. "You already knew," he said. "I suspected," she said. "When the interference happened, I pulled the cartographic files myself. I've been looking at them for 6 hours. A pause. "Commander, the lattice isn't just defensive. Look at the vector geometry. If those objects are carrying any kind of payload, if there is any energy storage in any of them, the lattice geometry means they're already positioned to direct an energy release inward." Verksal felt something he rarely felt. He felt cold. "Inward," he repeated. "Whatever they built this to do, it isn't aimed at us." Sarenvac's voice was precise and very careful. "Commander, this lattice is aimed at itself. It's designed to collapse inward. That would destroy the planet." "Yes," she said, "it would." Another pause. "It would also destroy everything inside the lattice at the moment of collapse." Verksal stood very still. 1,244,000 ships were inside the lattice. They had flown into position themselves, because the human formation was the perfect target geometry, and the humans had sent the fleet's own approach data the moment the Dominion Scout formation was detected. "How long have they been able to trigger this?" he said, and his voice came out wrong, flattened, like the question itself had weight. 11 years, Sarenvac said. "Minimum, they could have collapsed it the moment we arrived. They chose not to." "Why?" It wasn't a question he expected her to answer. She answered it anyway. "Because," she said slowly, "I don't think they want to destroy us. I think they want us to understand what they chose not to do. There is a difference, Commander, and I believe they designed this entire situation to make sure we felt it." Voss was in the operations center when the Dominion's communication channel shifted frequency. The shift was minor, the kind of thing that automated systems flag as a status change, without attaching any particular significance. She noticed it because she'd been watching the channel continuously for 9 days, and she had internalized its rhythms the way you internalize the sound of a building's ventilation system. Not consciously, but completely. "They changed the transmission protocol," she said. The analyst next to her pulled up the log. "Yeah, about 4 minutes ago. They're What?" "They're requesting a direct communication channel, not a group broadcast. Point-to-point, encrypted, addressed to," he looked up. "It's addressed to you, Dr. Voss, by name." The room went quiet in stages, like a sound wave moving from her outward. She looked at the address header on the screen. Her name. In the Dominion's own script, which they had no reason to know she could read, and which she did read because she'd spent 5 years learning it from the signal fragments in SETI's historical archives, the ones that most of her colleagues had classified as noise artifacts. "Put it through," she said. Demir's voice came from directly behind her. She hadn't heard him enter. "Voss, do not answer without." "I'm answering," she said. She picked up the headset. She opened the channel. She said in Dominion Standard, her pronunciation imperfect but functional, "This is Dr. Marin Voss. I'm here." The response came in the same language, from a voice she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe to people who asked. The best she could ever manage was, it sounded like someone who had just realized they were afraid. "You know our language." "Some of it enough." A pause. How long? 5 years of your signals before you arrived, before you formally announced yourselves. She kept her voice even. We've been listening to you for a long time, Commander, longer than you think. The silence on the other end was different from a communications delay. It was the silence of something being reconsidered. The debris field, the voice said. Yes. You could have destroyed us when we entered formation. Yes. Why didn't you? Voss closed her eyes briefly. She'd thought about how to answer this for 9 days, not because the answer was complicated, because the answer was so simple that she was afraid it would sound like a threat. Because we don't want to destroy you, she said. We want you to go home and tell everyone what we chose not to do. There is a difference, Commander. We believe you're intelligent enough to feel it. Another silence, longer. The lattice, the voice said finally. The payload and the debris objects, you have never activated it. No. Can you activate it? Yes. At any moment. At any moment. The silence that followed was so long that the analyst next to Voss quietly checked whether the channel was still open. Then the voice said, very carefully, we have no word in standard for what a species is called when it builds the capacity for absolute destruction and then chooses to carry it in silence, without using it, without threatening with it, without even revealing it exists. Voss thought about that, about what word they didn't have. We have a word for it, she said. It's an old one, the one we use for a person who could end a fight instantly and instead stands still and waits and hopes they won't have to. She didn't say the word. She let the silence carry it. What happened next was not immediate, and it was not clean, and the historical accounts that would later describe it as a diplomatic triumph would be, in Demir's considered opinion, approximately 40% accurate and 60% comfortable fiction. The Dominion fleet did not withdraw immediately. They held formation for 6 more days while Verksal and his senior staff processed, argued, modeled, remodeled, and argued again. Sarenvac submitted 3 separate reports recommending immediate withdrawal and was overruled twice. The third report she addressed directly to the Dominion Council, bypassing Verksal's command authority entirely, a procedural escalation that would have ended her career in any prior context, and instead, under the circumstances, was simply logged without consequence because everyone was too occupied with the more immediate question of what the humans had actually built. On day 14, a Dominion technical team, with explicit human permission, conducted a close inspection of 17 debris objects. They brought their own instruments. They took their own readings. The technical team's report to Verksal was 300 pages long. He read all of it. Then he called Sarenvac. The payload, he said. I read it, she said. The effective yield, if the lattice collapsed simultaneously. I know. Every ship in the formation. I know, Commander. They built this to be undetectable. They built it to be self-stable. They built it to trigger passively on a dead man's signal so that destroying them would only guarantee their own death if someone shot them first. He stopped. Sarenvac. They were not deterred by our arrival. They were already. Ready, she said. They were already ready. Before we got here, before we sent the signal. They were ready before we'd made the decision to come. Another pause. Commander, do you understand what that means about how they perceive the galaxy? He did. He had been sitting with that understanding for approximately 6 hours, and it had not gotten easier. It meant the humans had looked at the galaxy they lived in, the same galaxy occupied by species with million-ship fleets, species with faster-than-light travel, species with 10,000 years of military history, and had not panicked, had not collapsed, had not prayed or surrendered or built futile defenses. They had looked at all of it, and quietly, patiently, over 11 years of classified work funded through debris mitigation budgets, they had built a cage. Not for themselves. A cage they were willing to sit inside. A cage designed so that anyone who came to threaten them would have to enter it first. And then they had waited. "Begin withdrawal preparations," Verksal said. "Yes, Commander." "And Sarenvac." "Sir." "When we file the contact report with the Council, the full report, not the summary, make sure the technical appendix is classified at the highest available tier." He looked out at Earth, still blue and quiet on his display. "I don't want every species in the Dominion reading the specifics of what the humans built, not because it would embolden them." She waited. "Because," he said slowly, "I am not certain that reading it wouldn't embolden others, and some of those others," he stopped. "Some of those others are not as careful as the humans were." On day 19, the Dominion fleet began withdrawing. Voss watched it from the operations center roof. She'd brought coffee, and Demir was there, which she hadn't expected, standing with his hands in his coat pockets in the cold, watching the feeds on a tablet instead of the sky. The withdrawal showed in the sky as a gradual dimming of the points of reflected light that had been visible to the naked eye since day 2. Not dramatic, just less. "How many people died?" she asked. "None," Demir said. "On our side, not directly." She heard the qualifier, but. "The project that built the lattice ran for 11 years. There were accidents, 3 engineers on the payload installation team, 1 astronaut during a positioning deployment in 2031. He didn't look up from his tablet. They knew what they were building. They knew why. They signed on anyway." Voss was quiet for a moment. "Do their families know what they contributed to?" "They know it was important. The specifics are still classified." "For how long?" Demir finally looked up. In the cold, his breath came out in small white clouds. "Voss, if we declassify the technical specifications of what we built, every government on Earth will spend the next 20 years arguing about who controls it, whether it should be dismantled, whether it was ethical to build it without a global vote." He stopped. "And the Dominion will be back within 30 years, with a different formation, once they've had time to develop countermeasures." Voss looked at him. "You're already thinking about the next one." "I never stopped." She looked back at the sky. The lights were fewer now, noticeably fewer. "The lattice is still up." "It'll stay up." His voice was matter-of-fact, completely, almost aggressively normal. "We'll expand it over the next decade. New positioning algorithm, greater coverage, deeper passive correction system." "And when another fleet comes," she said. "If," he said. "When?" He didn't argue. He knew the history as well as she did, probably better. "When another fleet comes," she said, "we'll be ready." "We'll be ready," he agreed. She finished her coffee. The cup was cold before she was halfway through it, and she drank it cold without noticing. Around them, the operations center was still running, still lit, still filled with the continuous sound of human coordination that hadn't paused in 19 days and probably wouldn't pause for weeks yet, because Demir was already thinking about the next one, and enough other people were thinking the same way that the machinery didn't need to be told to keep moving. It just did. It just kept going. The Dominion's contact report, in its classified full form, circulated among the 47 senior council members who held the necessary clearance level. It contained Sarenvac's tactical analysis, Verksal's personal observations, the technical team's 300-page examination of the lattice, and a 3-paragraph addendum that Verksal wrote himself, without assistance, on the last night before the fleet completed its withdrawal. The addendum was not technically required. It wasn't part of standard reporting format. He wrote it anyway. It read in translation: "We encountered a species which by every material metric should have experienced paralyzing fear in our presence. They did not. We initially attributed this to psychological incapacity, an inability to process the scale of what they faced. This interpretation was incorrect. They processed it completely. They processed it 11 years before we arrived. What we interpreted as the stillness of species in shock was the stillness of a people who had already decided. They had decided before we came. They have been deciding continuously since before our surveillance began. I do not know how long ago they looked at the galaxy and made their first decision. I know only that by the time we arrived, the decision had long since settled into something that had no name for fear left in it. The word they used, the one they have for an entity that carries absolute capacity and chooses silence, is not in our standard vocabulary. We should add it. I do not know what word to use. I only know that we came to show them what power looked like, and they showed us something we cannot classify, something patient, something very old, something that was waiting. The addendum was read by all 47 council members. Then it was read, in quiet transmission, by the intelligence services of 11 other galactic powers who monitored Dominion Council communications. Then it was read, eventually, by most of the species in the explored galaxy, because secrets of that size don't hold forever. And every species that read it reached in their own way, in their own language, through their own cultural frameworks, the same conclusion: that the small blue planet at the edge of the Orion Arm was not defended by the strongest navy in the galaxy, not protected by the most advanced technology, not guarded by the fiercest warriors. It was guarded by the particular, specific, ancient, and ungovernable human quality of being willing to sit quietly inside a cage of their own construction, in the dark, for 11 years, in the presence of a galaxy full of species that could end them and not flinch, not rush, not beg. Just wait. Just remain. Just continue. Because somewhere in the long archive of every catastrophe the human species had survived, they had learned something that no other civilization in the explored galaxy had yet managed to learn: that the most dangerous thing in any confrontation is not the species with the largest fleet. It is the species that has already made its peace with the worst possible outcome and is still standing there, waiting